Miles Carter, a 35-year-old software engineer who had recently moved to Oakwood Acres for a quieter life, believed that his new suburban setting would offer a welcome escape from city chaos. He had purchased a modest single-story house situated just outside the official jurisdiction of the local homeowners association. The place came with a decent backyard, an aging oak tree, and enough space for the small vegetable garden he'd always dreamed of tending in his free time. In truth, Miles had heard whispers about how overbearing the HOA in Oakwood Acres could be, but he figured those warnings were exaggerations. After all, how much trouble could an HOA possibly cause for someone who wasn't even a member? When he first met Karen Spaulding, president of the Oakwood Acres HOA, he didn't think twice about her polite smile. She introduced herself one Saturday morning, wearing a crisp beige blazer with the HOA's insignia pinned to the lapel. Karen was in her mid-40s, short-haired, and known for patrolling the neighborhood in her sleek SUV, always carrying a leather-bound planner full of citations and warnings for unsuspecting homeowners. She gave Miles a sugar-sweet greeting, commending him on his recently trimmed hedges, and then gently reminded him that, most folks here do things by the book. Miles, wanting to remain on good terms, simply nodded and tried to reciprocate her small talk. He had no idea how quickly that facade of politeness would dissolve. It turned out Karen was single-handedly responsible for orchestrating a number of regulations around the neighborhood, most of which she enforced even on homes that weren't strictly under her official domain. She had a reputation for door-knocking if lawns were too long or if mailboxes didn't match her approved color palette. Miles brushed aside these anecdotes, not realizing that her brand of neighborly concern was only the tip of a much larger iceberg. A few weeks later, Karen waltzed onto his property without so much as a phone call. She claimed she was there to discuss the benefits of joining the HOA. Miles, who had never intended to sign up, politely explained that he wasn't interested in any additional monthly fees or rules dictating what color he could paint his shutters. Karen's tone shifted instantly. Her shoulders squared, her voice took on a hard edge, and she dropped phrases like, community expectations, and civic responsibilities, as though Miles's rejection was some kind of personal affront. He felt a wave of discomfort but managed to keep his composure. After a terse exchange, Karen left, reminding Miles that he might come to regret missing out on the benefits the HOA provided. What she meant by that, he couldn't guess. He simply assumed she was bluffing. However, there was an unsettling look in her eye, as though she had already mapped out a strategy to bring him to heel. Miles turned around that day feeling a sliver of unease, but he never suspected Karen might stoop to something truly underhanded. He had no clue that his relatively peaceful evenings in his cozy house were soon to be shattered by a string of events that started with subtle intimidation and ended with shocking sabotage, literally. For the next 2 weeks, Miles went about his daily routine, occasionally spotting Karen in passing. She would give him a quick, tight-lipped smile that never reached her eyes. Then one Thursday, his power cut out in the middle of an online work meeting. His screen went dark, the central AC unit clicked off, and his refrigerator emitted a low groan before all was silent. Initially, he shrugged it off as a run-of-the-mill outage, maybe a downed power line or utility maintenance. He stepped outside to check if anyone else's lights were flickering. To his confusion, every other house on the street still shimmered with normal activity. Neighbors' TVs glowed through living room windows, porch lights lit up the driveways, and the usual hum of air conditioners buzzed faintly. It dawned on him that the blackout was localized, his house was the only one in the dark. He tried the main switch at the breaker box, but nothing changed. Miles felt a chill creep up his spine. There was something more to this, and he had a nagging suspicion about who might be behind it. The next morning, after a restless night of candlelight and frustration, Miles reached out to the local power company. He received the polite response that there hadn't been any reported outages in his area, and that all accounts, including his, were in good standing. When he told them his power was off nonetheless, the representative on the phone suggested that a technician visit. Sure enough, a company van arrived later that day and an older technician named Ron hopped out. Ron fiddled around with the meter, the breaker, and then poked a flashlight through a narrow gap near the cables running underground. He frowned, tugging on a disconnected line near the side of the property. Then he turned to Miles, shaking his head in confusion. It looked like the main electrical connection to Miles's home had been deliberately tampered with. Someone had cut power externally. When the technician asked if Miles had recently done any renovation or if a neighbor had complained about his usage, Miles's heart dropped. He couldn't believe Karen would actually sabotage his electricity just because he wouldn't sign that ridiculous HOA contract. And yet, as he rewound the last couple of conversations, he could almost hear Karen's voice echoing in his ears, "You might regret not joining." The thought of a neighbor cutting off someone's electricity felt almost unthinkable, but he couldn't ignore the possibility. With no formal proof, Miles kept his suspicions under wraps for the moment, but he asked Ron to take photographs. The technician shrugged and obliged, snapping a few shots of the severed line and the odd angle at which it had been manipulated. Within a few hours, the connection was restored. Even as the lights flickered back on, Miles felt the weight of the intrusion. This was beyond petty. He dreaded the thought that his troubles were only beginning. And indeed, over the next days, strange letters began arriving in his mailbox, anonymous notes that complained about everything from the color of his fence to the wild growth around his tomato plants. It was obviously Karen's handiwork, hammered out on a standard printer with no signature. The tone was condescending, like he was a delinquent in need of correction. Miles tried ignoring them, but each new letter was more audacious than the last, suggesting he should reconsider joining the HOA to benefit from stable services. Meanwhile, Karen kept up her usual neighborhood patrols, greeting other residents with over-the-top enthusiasm while shooting him discreet glares. The more he thought about it, the more Miles realized that Karen was prepared to do anything to force him under her authority. On one hand, he considered calling the police. On the other, he questioned if that would escalate matters beyond repair. For the moment, he filed the letters away, consulted with a friend who happened to be a paralegal, and began strategizing how to defend himself. Inside, though, a simmering anger began to grow. He wasn't someone prone to conflict, but cutting a man's electricity was a violation that practically begged for retribution. And retribution would come, legally, but powerfully. If Karen wanted war, Miles would show her that he wasn't a pushover. A few days later, the real escalation began. One evening, Miles had just returned from the hardware store with some security cameras. His plan was to install them quietly, without alerting Karen, in case she tried something else. He was unpacking the camera set in his garage when the lights flickered again. Heart pounding, he bolted to the side of the house and spotted a shadow near the power meter. Someone was fiddling with the cables in near darkness. His voice caught in his throat as he yelled, "Hey, stop!" Startled, the figure hissed something inaudible and sprinted away, vanishing into the gloom around the hedges. By the time Miles got there, whoever it was had disappeared. Though he hadn't gotten a good look at the intruder, a sinking feeling told him that Karen was behind this blatant act. The next morning, Miles wasted no time installing the cameras at key angles around his property, one near the power meter, another by the front porch, and a third covering the side gate. He made them as discreet as possible, but still functional enough to catch any unauthorized intruder in the act. The anger he'd been suppressing began morphing into a fierce resolve. He wanted to catch Karen red-handed, and more than that, he wanted to ensure she faced serious consequences. Secretly, he reached out to a lawyer his paralegal friend had recommended, explaining the situation and showing the photos of the severed power line. The lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Lauren, advised him to gather as much evidence as possible. She also recommended that, if proof surfaced tying Karen to the sabotage, he should consider pressing charges and possibly filing a civil suit for damages. Miles was no fan of lawsuits, but he had no intention of letting Karen terrorize him or any other neighbor. The next week was a tense waiting game. Each night, Miles checked his cameras, reviewed the footage, and quietly documented every letter that arrived. The messages had become borderline threatening. "You cannot just live here and disrespect our organization," one note read, while another threatened further action if he continued ignoring the unwritten community guidelines. It was comically underhanded, but also deeply alarming. He made copies of every page and slipped them into a folder labeled Evidence. By the fourth day after installing the cameras, he caught what he was looking for. Shortly after midnight, a figure stepped onto his property, tiptoeing toward the meter box with what looked like a small set of tools. The night vision footage wasn't Hollywood crisp, but it was clear enough to see the intruder's face as they turned slightly toward the camera, perhaps reacting to a faint red light on the device. It was Karen, as unambiguous as if she'd declared her name out loud. She wore a hoodie over her hair, gloves on her hands, but that unmistakable profile and posture gave her away. When she realized a camera was trained on her, she froze for a second. Then she darted off, but it was too late. Miles had the smoking gun. Adrenaline coursed through him as he replayed the clip. The shock of Karen's audacity mingled with relief. He finally had irrefutable proof. The next morning, he took the footage to Lauren, his lawyer, who nearly whistled in surprise at how bold Karen had been. "This is more than enough," Lauren assured him. "We can press charges for property damage and attempted sabotage." But Miles wasn't content with merely calling the cops and letting the system handle it. He recalled the smug expression Karen had worn when she hinted that he'd regret not joining. He wanted her to feel that regret herself, and he believed there was a more devastating way to do it, one that would knock her off the self-made pedestal she'd built as HOA president. At this point, Miles realized something crucial: the HOA's leadership in Oakwood Acres wasn't just Karen alone. There was a board, a few other members, and a handful of loyal residents who believed that Karen's strict rules maintained property values. If he went after just Karen, she might squirm out of full accountability by calling it a simple misunderstanding or excessive enforcement of regulations. But if he could show that she'd abused her role, used intimidation tactics, and illegally tampered with utilities, the entire board might have to distance itself from her or face neighborhood backlash. So, Miles refined his plan. First, he alerted the local police department, turning over the footage so they had a record of the incident. They seemed skeptical that an HOA president would go this far, but they accepted the evidence and filed an official report. Second, he compiled a neatly documented dossier on the entire fiasco, every threatening letter, every date and time that his electricity went out, and the photos showing the cut lines. He labeled everything meticulously, with sections devoted to the chronology of sabotage, the presence of cameras, and the final midnight video. Third, he found out the date of the next HOA general meeting, which was set to happen in just under 2 weeks. Miles planned to attend, even though he wasn't a member, because it was open to the entire neighborhood. By then, he hoped the police would at least question Karen, rattling her composure before she could rally her supporters. For the next several days, he heard little from Karen. She stopped leaving letters in his mailbox, stopped giving him dirty looks on the street. He suspected she'd realized she was caught on camera and was lying low while she tried to figure out how to spin the story. Meanwhile, rumors spread around Oakwood Acres. People whispered that Karen had gotten into some kind of trouble, that the police had shown up at her door one afternoon, and that she was desperate to keep something under wraps. Miles caught glimpses of her occasionally, but she always rushed inside, hiding behind drawn curtains. There was a flicker of satisfaction in him each time he thought about her fortress of arrogance finally crumbling. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around, Miles was ready to put on a show. He arrived at the community center early, greeted politely by other residents who recognized him from around the neighborhood. Many of them were curious why he'd shown up. After all, he wasn't an HOA member. But when Karen spotted him from across the room, the color drained from her face. She was standing near a folding table, surrounded by her usual clique of supporters. She attempted to wave him off, wearing a sickly smile that feigned normality, but he walked past her without a word. The meeting started with a mundane roll call, followed by a summary of last month's budget for seasonal decorations. Then Karen, as president, began her usual lecture about community standards. She stood at the front, trying to project authority, but her voice wavered as she spoke about ensuring compliance and maintaining a neighborly spirit. Midway through her rehearsed monologue, Miles calmly raised his hand. Caught off guard, Karen paused. The entire room went silent as she grudgingly asked if he had a question. Instead of a simple query, Miles stepped forward and announced that he had significant evidence of misconduct by the HOA leadership, specifically naming Karen. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the audience. Karen, looking panicked, tried to interrupt him, but Miles politely refused to yield the floor. Without missing a beat, he held up a USB flash drive and stated it contained footage of someone, who just happened to be the HOA president, tampering with his electrical supply on his property. He offered to show it right then and there. Karen's face contorted. She snapped at him, claiming there must be some misunderstanding, possibly a manipulated video. But Miles pulled out a series of printed screenshots, each depicting her face from different angles, each timestamped and watermarked from his security system. The jaws of the attendees practically hit the floor. Karen's closest allies began to scoot away from her as though she carried a contagious disease. Her frantic attempts at denial only made her look more foolish. The evidence was undeniable, and everyone in the room could see it. Miles then gave a concise timeline, citing the repeated sabotage of his electricity and the threatening letters urging him to join the HOA or face consequences. The tension in the room turned thick, and several board members exchanged horrified glances as they realized the gravity of the situation. Suddenly, they weren't just dealing with a petty neighbor squabble, they were facing potential lawsuits, or even criminal charges against their sitting president. One older gentleman on the board stood up and demanded Karen explain herself. Another woman suggested that if these allegations were true, Karen had acted entirely on her own. That sparked a roomful of chatter, with some shouting that they never wanted these strong-arm tactics. Karen, trapped in a corner, stammered incoherent excuses. She tried to claim that she was protecting the neighborhood from outsiders who took advantage of shared resources. But her words sounded ridiculous, especially after the photos and video told a completely different story. By the end of the meeting, the board hastily scheduled an emergency session to discuss leadership restructuring. Karen, on the verge of tears, practically fled from the podium. Miles merely watched her storm out the side door, her authority dissolving with each step, and felt a surge of adrenaline-fueled satisfaction. In the ensuing days, Karen's downfall accelerated at breakneck speed. News traveled through Oakwood Acres fast, and soon she became the subject of every hushed conversation on driveways and at the local coffee shop. The board, desperate to maintain a semblance of credibility, publicly announced that Karen had been suspended from her presidential duties pending an internal investigation. Unofficially, everyone knew that her suspension was code for "she's done for good." Meanwhile, Miles turned over the evidence to the police, who finally took official statements and began their own investigation into property damage and illegal tampering with utilities. The shock of potential legal repercussions forced Karen into an even darker corner. She tried to hire a lawyer, but rumor had it that after seeing the security footage, the lawyer suggested Karen might want to settle quietly to avoid a lengthy trial. That settlement, if it ever came, would cost her thousands in damages, and not just for the lost power or the emotional distress Miles had experienced. He had also lost wages from being cut off mid-project at his job, forcing him to make up hours at unpredictable times. Additionally, the fiasco had caused groceries to spoil, incurred expenses for additional security measures, and inflicted general havoc on his personal life. Lauren, Miles's lawyer, was ready to pounce. But ironically, while the possibility of a private settlement loomed, Karen's entire social standing in the neighborhood was disintegrating. Neighbors who once admired her dedication to property values realized they had unknowingly backed a bully. Stories began surfacing about how Karen had tried to fine a retired couple for planting flowers outside HOA guidelines, or how she forced a young family to remove a swing set because it was too brightly colored. With her intimidation tactics stripped away, Karen had no supporters left. Even her so-called friends started ghosting her messages. One by one, the HOA board members distanced themselves, claiming they'd never approved or even known about such extreme measures. In an almost comical display of moral whiplash, they all pivoted to praising Miles's restraint and apologizing on behalf of unfortunate leadership errors. Miles found it both amusing and aggravating. He politely accepted their apologies, but the damage had been done. The final blow came when the board, under pressure from embarrassed homeowners, voted to remove Karen from her position permanently. They stripped her of any official capacity within the HOA, banned her from further involvement in community decisions, and even recommended that she seek counseling or take a long break from neighborhood affairs. The formal letter they drafted was a withering condemnation, citing gross abuse of authority and dangerous disregard for a neighbor's safety. Copies of that letter circulated far beyond the HOA's domain, all but ensuring Karen's local reputation was ruined. Rumor had it that she would never show her face at the community center again. Miles watched from a distance as the woman who had caused him so much grief abruptly tried to sell her house. She found no takers, at least not for the inflated price she expected. Prospective buyers balked at the idea of moving into a property with a scandalous history attached to it. Meanwhile, neighbors on each side of Karen's home had no interest in seeing her remain. The atmosphere was hostile. She had become the neighborhood pariah. Ultimately, faced with legal fees, settlement talks, and the realization that almost everyone despised her, Karen packed up her SUV one morning and discreetly disappeared. A "for sale by owner" sign went up the following week, but no flurry of activity followed. The place sat empty, neglected, a monument to her downfall. Miles drove by a few days later, trying to quell the small twinge of pity he felt. But pity was outweighed by relief. She had tried to ruin his life over a membership he never needed, orchestrating sabotage that could have turned dangerous if wires had sparked or if someone else had been there during her midnight tampering. He felt Northwest guilt watching the place rot until some out-of-town buyer eventually scooped it up for a fraction of its original price. When Miles finally sat down one weekend, reflecting on everything that had happened, he realized how surreal it all was. In the space of a few weeks, he had gone from a newcomer, eager for quiet suburbia, to a man whose home had been turned into a battlefield by an overzealous HOA tyrant. Yet justice had prevailed. Thanks to his thorough documentation and the cool-headed counsel of his lawyer, he hadn't just protected himself, he'd liberated the entire neighborhood from Karen's reign. Some residents stopped by his place with small gifts or expressions of gratitude. A single mother who had clashed with Karen over a child's bicycle left a thank you note. An elderly couple, whose mailbox Karen insisted was the wrong shade of green, invited Miles to dinner. For the first time, he actually felt like part of a real community, bonded not by the HOA's iron fist rules but by shared relief that the nightmare was finally over. Months later, Miles still lived in Oakwood Acres, enjoying the calmer environment he'd originally sought. He had his vegetable garden thriving again, unburdened by random blackouts. Sometimes, while watering his tomatoes in the early evening glow, he remembered the sheer audacity of how Karen had cut his electricity in an attempt to bully him into compliance. It felt oddly distant now, like a wild rumor rather than a personal experience. And yet the moral of that bizarre saga remained crystal clear: sometimes the biggest battles arise from the smallest sparks. Karen had chosen intimidation and sabotage, but Miles had responded with evidence, legal force, and a pinch of well-deserved public exposure. In the end, the one who had tried to impose absolute control ended up losing everything, while Miles gained a newfound confidence in standing up for himself. And so life continued in Oakwood Acres, calmer and friendlier without Karen's presence. People mowed their lawns without fear of fines, painted their shutters bold colors if they felt like it, and sipped lemonade on front porches knowing that no paranoid busybody would come knocking. Miles couldn't help but smile to himself whenever he recalled the dramatic climax at that HOA meeting, the hush that fell when he presented the footage, Karen's shocked expression, and the board's sudden realization that they had harbored a tyrant in their midst. If there was one thing he had learned, it was that bullies often hide behind regulations and threats, hoping nobody dares shine a light on their misdeeds. But once that light was cast, there was nowhere for Karen to run except out of Oakwood Acres altogether. And that, in Miles's view, was exactly how it needed to end. The neighborhood was better off without its self-appointed dictator, and he, at long last, had the peaceful home life he'd been searching for from day one.